Welcome, everybody. I'll just give everybody a moment to get in. Welcome. Okay, I think we're going to start. Welcome, everybody, to Tamils in Finance Leadership Journeys. The goal of this series is to bring you senior level executives who can share their journey from both a personal and career standpoint. We have been very fortunate to welcome exceptional executives today, and tonight is no exception with Arshil Jamal. Now, many of you have probably realized that Arshil is not Tamil, and that's because our goal with the Finance Leadership Journey series is to bring exceptional executives from all backgrounds so that our memberships and guests get exposure to a diverse array of experiences to learn from and leverage in their own careers. Now, Arshil's resume and position are very impressive, but I think everyone is going to be pleasantly surprised by how relatable Arshil is. I believe his story will not only resonate with you, but I think it's going to inspire you. My name is Connie Sarvanandan, and I'm a real estate agent. But before I became a real estate agent, I worked in the corporate world for almost 30 years, and my last position was Senior Vice President of International for HBO. I am fortunate enough to moderate tonight because I am friends with Arshil's wife, Naseem, who is fantastic, and I met her while I was volunteering at Parkinson's Canada. Now, a couple of things before I introduce Arshil. I wanted to just go through some logistics. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A section, and we will try and get to as many as we can. And then also, if you want to see the recording of this, it will be up on the YouTube channel. It should be up in a couple of days. So if you've missed something or you want to rewatch it or share it with anybody, you can watch it on the YouTube channel in a couple of days. So with that, with no further ado, I am going to introduce Arshil. So Arshil currently works for Great-West Lifeco, and his title is, and I need to read this, President and Group Head, Strategy, Investments, Reinsurance, and Corporate Development. And in this role, his focus is identifying and driving value creation initiatives across the company. Now, prior to this role, he was the President and Chief Operating Officer of Europe and Reinsurance. And then he's been with the company for over 20 years. He's done several different senior executive roles, including being Chief Actuary and Executive Vice President of Capital Management. From an education standpoint, Arshil graduated from the University of Toronto with a Bachelor of Science degree, where he had a major in actuarial science, and then he did his MBA at Western at Ivy. Now, from a actuarial science standpoint, he is a fellow of the Society of Actuaries. He's a fellow of the Canadian Institute of Actuaries, and he's also a member of the American Academy of Actuaries. And then finally, Arshil is married to his wonderful wife, Naseem, and they also have two children who are currently in university. So that is Arshil. Welcome, Arshil.
Good evening. How are you?
I am fantastic. We are so excited to have you here. I have to tell you, it's been a while since we've had one of these, and it's really exciting that we were able to get somebody of your caliber. So, so the first question I have for you, Arshil, is based on a great story that you have, which is a full circle story. And that is Arshil and his family own a property in a fantastic neighborhood in Toronto. And the full circle story is that Arshil's parents actually rented an apartment in that same neighborhood. And that's where he grew up. So Arshil, do you want to talk about what it was like being an immigrant and how being an immigrant really influenced your career and your choices?
Yeah, so I'm delighted to be here, Connie, and really looking forward to the conversation and the questions from the audience member. So as you mentioned, I'm a senior executive at Great-West Lifeco, and for those of you who don't know the company all that well, we trade on the Toronto Stock Exchange, majority owned by Power Corporation. And we operated in Canada as Canada Life Insurance. We used to also operate as London Life and Great-West Life. So it's really those three companies in Canada that have come together. So the holding company is Great-West Life, and now the operating company in Canada is Canada Life. In the US, we have a big retirement business, 401k retirement business, and that's branded Empower Retirement. So if anybody's watching US television, particularly any of the financial channels, you'll often see ads for Empower Retirement or Personal Capital. And we also have an asset management company in the US in Boston, Putnam Investments. So all of those are part of sort of our brand. And then we also operate in Europe, where I had a European responsibility for a number of years. And we use the Canada Life brand in the UK and in Germany. And during my tenure responsible for the European businesses, we acquired Irish Life from the government right after the financial crisis. So we operate in Ireland as Irish Life. So that's sort of the company. And we are what you would expect a life and pensions company to be. We do retirement, we do protection. We don't do home and auto. That's not us or whatever, although we do a little bit of that kind of thing in our reinsurance business. And for the most part, we do employee benefits, individual insurance protection, and then retirement savings. So that's sort of the company and the background. And then you started off with sort of a question on the neighborhood or whatever, and sort of that immigrant experience. So I came to Canada in 1974 when I was 6 years old, and my brother was a year and a half. So my brother is 5 years younger than me. And then much later, my sister was born here in Canada, and she is 10 years younger than my brother and 15 years younger than me. And so, my great-grandparents, depending on which side of the family, started off in Gujarat. But I was born in Tanzania in East Africa, and I guess it's not an uncommon Gujarat story or whatever for people to have migrated across from India into East Africa, whether it's Kenya or Zanzibar or even South Africa, whatever. There was quite a migration, I think, in the 1900s. And then we left Tanzania in 1974, and it's particularly poignant to whatever because we left the year after Idi Amin expelled all of the South Asians from Uganda, and we lived in a tiny little town in Tanzania, and most of the business, most of the trading we did was with people in Uganda. So while we weren't Ugandan refugees, and it's their 50th anniversary of being welcomed into Canada, and there have been a number of very nice ceremonies, we came the year after, and so our family business was very adversely impacted by all of those developments, and the political environment was very, very difficult. So, I moved to Toronto very, very long time ago now, 48 years ago, 49 years ago, whatever. It feels like ages ago. And we lived downtown for the first little while, and my father and his brother owned a restaurant there. But the first place that we got really established was in an apartment building off of Carluke Crescent in the Bayview and Shepherd neighborhood. And literally, I live now 100 yards from where I went to elementary school. And it's no longer an elementary school, but it's still a voting station. And there's some teacher training that goes on there. And so I'm actually looking forward again to the municipal elections coming up in October, later this month or whatever, because we get to go back into the gym that I was in when I was growing up or whatever, sort of the first school dance or whatever, whenever we go in to vote. And I bore the kids to death walking into the school or into the playground or whatever, because that was such a big part of, sort of the start of our journey or whatever. So, the real difficult challenge was really my parents' challenge, in their very, very early 30s with two young kids. They moved halfway around the world or whatever to reestablish themselves here, sort of in the face of sort of economic difficulty and sort of a very uncertain political environment. And into a Toronto that was very, very different than it is today, whatever. I mean, being a visible minority in Toronto in the 1970s was a very different experience than the experience today. Toronto has changed all out of recognition in the last 50 years. So, the tougher journey was my parents' journey. We were, sort of, that traditional, success story or whatever, right? I mean, neither of my parents went to university, but fortunately their younger siblings all got an opportunity to go off to university. And then my brother and I and my sister were sort of the first generation in our immediate family to go off to university. And when you go off to university in that kind of environment after your parents have sacrificed so much and struggled so much, it is your opportunity and there's a lot expected or whatever. And so that was sort of the very typical background or whatever. Fortunately, we came to a good growing city. We lived in a reasonably nice neighborhood, although it was in a rental apartment or whatever. And then, we had lots of opportunities, lots of challenges, lots of struggles or whatever that we can get into or whatever. But then, established ourselves or whatever, lots of good role models, lots of good examples or whatever, and built really, really strong careers or whatever, both professionally. And I want to emphasize, like, while we're going to spend most of the time today talking sort of about a professional, success and things that have emerged or whatever, I'd encourage everybody to think more broadly about success than just professional success. Like, obviously, that's very important. As you come in from an immigrant background into a new country to establish yourself and to build roots and to give your kids and everybody else sort of the best possible chance. But, being good citizens, being good neighbors, being true to your family or whatever, all of those kinds of things, all of the success, volunteering, giving back to your community, all of those things are incredibly important as well. And so if we touch on some of those other things, that would be terrific as well. So, but yeah, a terrific neighborhood. And I'm not surprised, as given your current interest in real estate or whatever, that we start with location.
Exactly. So what I didn't realize is we both came to Canada in 1974. So I actually we arrived in 1974, and yes, it was a very different Toronto. My family faced a lot of racism in the 70s, and so it was quite challenging. And it's quite phenomenal to think that now, that's almost 50 years ago. I don't feel that old, but I guess I am. So, and I was 4 years old when I came. So, okay. So sticking to the theme about your family, I always joke around with you that I would love to have your parents come here, and I'd love to interview your parents because, they raised, as immigrants, they raised 3 very successful children. And the fascinating thing about it is all 3 of you are successful in much different ways. So I'd love to understand, well, first of all, I think you should talk about your siblings and their success, but also I'd love to understand from your standpoint, was there something foundational in your home that helped with this? Because as parents and as children, I think we'd all love to know that.
So yeah, no, happy to share sort of a little bit of their story as well or whatever, but obviously this is from my perspective and they might have slightly different views. And to form the full picture, you really have to study it from all sides or whatever. So as I indicated, my brother is 5 years younger than me. And while I went to U of T and studied actuarial science and then eventually did my MBA, my brother went to Waterloo and trained as an engineer, a systems design engineer. So, as tough as it was, studying for actuarial exams, going to Waterloo and studying systems design engineering was probably even harder. And then he started in sort of the management consulting world with one of the accounting firms or whatever, but in their consulting arm. And one of his early clients was ClearNet, which was sort of an upstart mobile telephone company or whatever out in Pickering way back in the day. And they liked his work so much or whatever that they hired him. So he went from sort of being a consultant to being a full-time employee at ClearNet. And the ClearNet journey was an incredible one. And then eventually they became part of TELUS. So my brother established himself as sort of very senior executive at TELUS. And at TELUS, he was senior VP of marketing for a number of years. And then there was a big exodus of executives or whatever who went from TELUS to Bell Canada, including George Cope, the Bell Canada CEO. And my brother stayed a little bit longer at TELUS or whatever, but that pull back across to Bell Canada became inexorable. So when George Cope was the CEO there and some of the other people from TELUS had moved across into senior roles, my brother moved from TELUS across to Bell Canada. And then until very recently, he was president and ran their biggest operating division that included sort of the 5 TV, home internet, the residential TV and small business or whatever. So he's taken some time off recently. And he and his wife have 2 beautiful sons, and then they adopted a baby girl as well or whatever. And so again, sort of that mantra of or that philosophy of, we need to be professionally successful, but then we also need to have well-rounded lives, and being able to raise their own children, but then adopt and give somebody else that kind of opportunity or whatever, very selfless or whatever. And my sister-in-law in particular is really a full-time volunteer who really gives back to the community or whatever. So real role models for their children and others around them. So I always describe it at family gatherings or whatever, that I'm the least successful of the three or whatever. And so as successful as I've been professionally, my brother has as well. And then a real commitment to other things. And then my sister, who's much younger, has 3 kids under the age of 10. So can you imagine, all through COVID or whatever, with all of the interruptions in schooling and everything else or whatever, trying to be a mother to 3 very young kids or whatever. And she's married to an engineer who's established himself and has a very good career, previously at Cadillac Fairview and now at Salesforce. But believe it or not, she's a physiotherapist by training, and she owns and operates 2 different physiotherapy clinics here in Toronto, in downtown Toronto. So 50 some odd employees. So how she manages to juggle a husband with professional obligations, who was just traveling this last week on business, 3 young kids with all of the COVID stuff going on, and then running sort of 2 businesses or whatever with all of the staff headaches and everything else, and dealing with sort of the COVID challenges both at home and then professionally or whatever. So we've been very fortunate, the last couple of summers, her kids come to our backyards for their swimming lessons. So I get to spend a lot of time with my nieces and nephews. And as much as our neighborhood is nice, my brother and his family live around the corner, and my sister, who's just a little bit south or whatever, brings her kids on a very regular basis or whatever. So the 3 of us are reasonably close knit or whatever. We get together all the time or whatever. And while all of the cousins now are very different ages, sort of ranging from 21, my oldest or whatever, down to 4, my sister's youngest or whatever, sort of the 8 grandkids, they spend all sorts of time together. And that's something you were asking about, sort of foundational things or whatever. And one of the things that I think we really picked up from my parents or whatever is, one, sort of a real dedication to community. Like, they were forever trying to give back or whatever. And then a really strong sense of family. And it would have been very typical for their generation or whatever to have large families with lots of siblings or whatever. And we're very fortunate, while some of the people are spread around or whatever, there's a reasonable concentration of uncles and aunts here in the Toronto area, in the GTA area. And then the cousins, sort of all of my first cousins or whatever, we're all very close as well or whatever. And so if there was a foundational thing, it was really that or whatever. It's as much as we were in a different place, far away from where they grew up and trying to establish ourselves, we always sort of had the sense of support, of community or whatever, of engagement or whatever, like, amongst ourselves, the immediate family, but then the extended family as well. And my dad in particular was an incredibly hospitable person or whatever. So we were just very used to, somebody that he barely knew, whatever, would show up at our house or whatever, and we're putting on an elaborate meal or something or whatever. And so, it was just always just a warm and welcoming place or whatever. And so despite all of the struggles, and there were lots, like financial struggles, medical struggles and other things or whatever, the thing that I remember the most or whatever is just a very warm and loving environment or whatever, with lots and lots of family and friends or whatever, and a real sense of giving back or whatever. And so, I've been very blessed or whatever with sort of siblings and extended family or whatever, who are in that Toronto area or whatever, and, important part of my life all the way growing up or whatever. And as I mentioned, while my parents didn't get a chance to go to university, their younger siblings really did or whatever. And so I was exposed from a very young age or whatever to people who'd gone to university, who built careers or whatever, and really established themselves sort of in that typical first generation style, lots of accountants, lots of engineers, lots of pharmacists, all of those kinds of things or whatever. And for me, it was very made a very strong impression or whatever, that there was a real divide, like people who had professional training managed to establish themselves and achieve sort of financial security in a much more comfortable way than people who didn't have university backgrounds or whatever, and had to really struggle for every last little bit. And their professional existence or whatever was a lot more precarious than it was for people who were a little bit more established or whatever. And so that's maybe the other thing that we sort of picked up, that there were good positive examples that we could draw on, And so, which is why I sort of love that I have the opportunity to do events like this and with, staff at Great-West Life and in other contexts or whatever, because the more people feel supported, the more people can see sort of positive examples. Hopefully people can draw inspiration and really stick to it or whatever, because there is a real payoff, I think, to being able to develop some of those things sort of earlier on or whatever, getting a good foundation at university, getting yourself professionally established or whatever with some designations or whatever, and then wherever you build your career, building a bit of a career and a network, getting those kinds of foundational things in place really makes a good difference or whatever, and really gives you a chance to take risks later on in your career or whatever. And so I think that's really, really important. And that's maybe the one thing that I could give to my kids that I really didn't have or whatever, is hopefully they feel comfortable all through their 20s that they can take risks in establishing themselves. Like, unlike a first generation immigrant with a bit of a precarious existence or whatever, we kind of had one shot, and I really am grateful to my parents for giving us that one shot or whatever. But hopefully my kids feel like they have 1, 2, or 3 shots or whatever, and they don't have to get it exactly right the first time. I hope they do, but if they don't or whatever, then we'll still all be around, and they'll get a second shot, and they might even get a third shot or whatever. And so it's going to be a different experience for them than it was. And everybody has a slightly different journey or whatever, but that was mine sort of very early on.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, as you talk about the journey, I remember you telling me a story about when you, as the oldest, as the oldest child, and also the first to kind of establish themselves and everybody else, you had certain obligations, right? There was expectations that you were going to help look after the family, that you were going to help look after your parents. And so I'm sure you made decisions about your career and your schooling and all of those things based on those obligations. So can you talk about that a little bit, and then also maybe provide some advice, because I have a feeling there are audience members that have those same expectations and obligations that they have
for sure. So we're very fortunate now that all of us, my brother and my sister, were sort of all well established. We can all chip in or whatever, and we all do our part and more. Like I couldn't. And the same with my wife and her family, whatever. She's one of 4 sisters or whatever, and all of Nassim and her sisters or whatever. Really pitch in or whatever, and make sure that everyone who needs taking care of gets the time and attention and support that they need or whatever. So, I was a little bit older than my brother or whatever, which, meant that, going off to university would have been just harder for me. So, my choices were constrained. So I went to U of T, while my brother and sister went to, Waterloo and McMaster or whatever. That's not to say that they didn't also have their struggles, and, there wasn't a lot of money or any of those kinds of things or whatever. So, it would have been hard for them, even in those environments. And we all had jobs when we were growing up, and we all contributed back to our families. And my parents rented their whole lives or whatever. And the first time we bought a house was out in Markham, but only after I got my first job after graduating. And for a number of years before I got married or whatever, I lived with my parents or whatever, and we owned the house together. And so, owning real estate in the Toronto area, even back then, forgetting the recent price increases and everything else, would have been very, very hard to do on 2 incomes. And we really needed 3 incomes to do that or whatever. And so we rented. So, one of the sort of important constraints on all of this is, going to university was a privilege. Going away to university was going to be a bridge too far. So it was here, and I commuted onto campus or whatever, took the subway in, took the subway back home every night. And at that time we lived at, Victoria Park and Danforth or whatever. So, taking the Bloor line east or whatever from U of T, from St. George Station or whatever, was sort of the nightly ritual to go home, not the on-campus experience that, others might get or whatever on campus. And then, real pressure to make sure that when you finish university, that you have a job and that you can financially contribute or whatever, because it is a privilege to be out there. And while we all had sort of jobs and we were contributing, it's very different full-time jobs versus part-time jobs while you're going to school and all of those kinds of things. And so, graduating and then being able to sort of, buy that first home or whatever was really one of the important things in my mind. And the other sort of anecdote that I like occasionally share, whatever, and we might get into it a little bit later, is, when I graduated as an actuary, it was just very difficult to explain, particularly to my mom, the type of work that I would be doing. And thankfully, it was a good job environment that the year that I graduated, and I had a few job offers or whatever. And I originally, my first job out of university was at Confederation Life, which is now the Rogers building up on Mount Pleasant in Bloor, that lovely new building. And one of the reasons I accepted the job there was because the building was beautiful. And I wanted to be able to show my mom, this is where I work. Like, we've done the hard work, you've done the sacrifice, and this is where I work. And the building was just very, very beautiful or whatever. So from the outside in, as an actuarial student, you get a couple of job offers and they all look really, really good. But that last little tipping point was, it's a really nice building. And looking back 25 years, 30 years later, it looks pretty shallow. But at the time, it was really, really important. We'd drive by the building or whatever, and I could point to the building, and my mom would have that extra little smile. Yeah, that's where her son works or whatever, right? And that's where her sacrifice led or whatever. And so it's funny how those little things take on outsized meanings or whatever. And so I just encourage everyone that it doesn't matter what it is, find those little things or whatever, so that you can relate to your parents, you can relate to others or whatever, and make them part of your journey and sort of share that success or whatever. And, I felt really proud walking into that Confederation Life building when it opened up as an employee with my pass card or whatever. And, I could have been the most junior person walking into the building, but I would still walk in sort of as a proud employee wanting to do really, really good work. Because as part of my journey, that was a real achievement or whatever. And given where my parents had come from and how they, struggled to establish myself or whatever, that had real meaning. So like that first day walking in, I felt proud. And I hope that sort of showed in the work that I was doing. Like, if we go in and you go in with that sort of, negative type of mindset or whatever, it is really, really hard to do your good work or whatever. So I would always go in with that very positive mindset or whatever. And it didn't really matter what others were doing there. I was there, I was proud to be there, and I was gonna, do my best to do a really, really good job, partly to make my mom proud, partly to make me proud, but then to, build that relationship with my manager, with my colleagues, all of those little things. And I just want to emphasize those little things, especially early in your career, they really, really matter. And if you're there and you're happy and you're fun to be around, then people want to be around you, whatever, and you will get those extra little opportunities or whatever. And so I just encourage people, and I know it might sound a little trite or whatever, because we all have burdens, challenges of family responsibility, all of those things or whatever. But if you take that with you everywhere that you go, then it's just an extra thing to overcome when you're trying to do good work or whatever. But if you go in with sort of that little bit of a positive gratitude, I think we've all seen the memes around Thanksgiving or whatever, and on the internet or whatever. Finding ways to practice gratitude, finding those little things or whatever. And early in my career, there weren't big things, right? Like, today I can celebrate bigger accomplishments or whatever, larger deals, and point to things that are really impactful for the whole organization. But early on, whatever, that's not the kind of impact that we have. But being able to go in and smile and talk to the security guard and show your pass card or whatever as you're signing in or whatever, I think that disposition, it certainly worked for me. Like being positive or whatever, being appreciative or whatever, let me do good work earlier in my career or whatever. And so maybe people can take something away from that. So.
Yeah, and I would say I completely agree with you, because it's about energy, right? It's about people showing up and the type of energy that they have, because when somebody has really good energy, they bring up the whole room. When somebody has negative energy, they bring down the whole room. So yeah, it is about attitude, because again, if you are known as the person that has negative energy, you're just not going to get the opportunities that somebody that may not have the same skill set, but people want to be around, are going to be presented with. So I totally see your point. Now going back, oh, sorry.
And I just want to emphasize, like, we can all have bad days. Like, I don't want anybody to feel like they need to go into the office if they struggled or something. If your child is sick and you have to stay up all night or whatever, obviously you're going to go in the next day and you're going to take some of that with you or whatever. So obviously, you can still be human. You can still be impacted by all of those things or whatever. And so, I don't want to set sort of this model minority myth or whatever. Like, we don't have to be model minorities or whatever. We don't have to be perfect or whatever. but we have to recognize where we came from. We have to recognize whatever opportunities we've had, and then make the most of those or whatever. And so I just encourage people or whatever. And that doesn't mean that people shouldn't understand that you have a bad day, that something could have happened or whatever. We don't need to be perfect every day, whatever. That should not be the expectation. And as Toronto has changed, and as companies have really put in sort of this philosophy of trying to have diverse talent, of building diverse teams, trying to reflect their customer base and the employment base or whatever, that's changed night and day compared to when we were first starting out in our careers or whatever, graduating in university or even being in university or whatever. So, being surrounded or being in environments or whatever, where there are people from all sorts of backgrounds or whatever, I take lots of inspiration in that or whatever. And then I just encourage you, the flip side of that or whatever is, when you're around people, if somebody is going through something very, very difficult, like reach out, extend some support, offer to take something off of their table or whatever. And as much as you go in with a positive attitude or whatever, if you can lessen the burden on somebody else or whatever, you will be that valued person or whatever. And that's also the right thing to do. Like, not all of this is about advancing your career. Some of this is just about being a good person or whatever, and making a positive contribution or whatever. And it doesn't really matter what it leads to. Hopefully it leads to something positive. I think it often does. But even if it doesn't, you will feel better about yourself or whatever. I think that kind of mindset or whatever. And my wife came up from a sales background or whatever. And one of the really inspiring things that salespeople can do, whatever, is they go in and they make a pitch and somebody says no. And then the next day they have to go and make that same pitch and discard the fact that somebody said no. And if I made a big pitch and somebody said no, I'd be upset for 2 days, a week or whatever. I'd still be carrying that around with me or whatever. And my wife, any good salesperson or whatever, you see it in them. They can compartmentalize, they can block that off, they can go that next day, they can make that sales pitch or whatever. And I think we really, really undervalue that skill or whatever, sort of sales and marketing. And again, that's one of the things that I really emphasize. Like, numbers were always very easy for me. That's why I became an actuary or whatever. But my career success, really came from yes, you got to get the numbers right. Yes, you have to be technically sound. People are counting on you to get the numbers right or whatever. But then being able to engage in sales and marketing, being able to make those pitches, hearing a no, then taking some feedback and trying to craft that pitch, refine that pitch, make that pitch again, trying to sell a proposition to your colleagues, making a presentation to the board or a regulator or whatever, all of those things or whatever. And so, hang out with real estate advisors or whatever, go in, make a bid, get it rejected or whatever, and then convince your client to make another bid. Like, if you can do that, those kinds of skills are universally applicable or whatever. And a lot of those softer skills or whatever, I would just really encourage. I did not have that opportunity early in my career to get exposed to those softer skills or whatever. And I really wish that I had or whatever. And so, I just encourage people or whatever to be well-rounded. And we all have our natural inclinations. So I'm never going to become a superstar salesperson or whatever, but I really appreciate what salespeople can do. Sort of that optimism, that way to bring two opposing people together where there's a big divide. You have an offer and you have a bid and you're trying to get to something that people can accept or whatever, trying to bridge that difference, those kinds of things. I learned much later in life or whatever, and I wish I'd learned some of that a little bit earlier. So I just encourage, like, inspiration is everywhere, wherever you choose to look at it or whatever, in all kinds of backgrounds or whatever. And so
I agree. And so we are getting some great questions in the chat, or the Q&A. But before we get to some of those, I did want to go back to, your mom is not the only one who wouldn't necessarily know what an actuary does. So can we just get a brief overview of what an actuary actually does? And then on top of that, if somebody plans on studying actuarial science at university, what kind of job prospects can they get? And what would they be looking at?
So, the essence of actuarial science or whatever is sort of combining sort of the elements of finance with statistics and then sort of a longer term orientation or whatever. So, traditionally actuarial roles sort of started with defined benefit pension plans. And I think the earliest actuaries came out of churches in the UK that had sort of retired priests, that people were making payments to. So people would be priests in their local community for 20, 25, 30 years or whatever. And then the community was committed to setting aside some money so that those priests would have lifetime pension income. So the earliest actuaries or whatever really started there or whatever, deciding how much money to set aside so that those local communities could ensure financial security for their retired priests or whatever. And those were the earliest insurance companies that started or whatever to take care of sort of parishioners or whatever, so that they would have income in retirement or whatever. And so there's a strand of actuarial science that started with sort of fire insurance and home and auto, but the strand that I'm more interested in, that I spent most of my career, is sort of this long-term financial security. So most of what we're doing on actuarial science is trying to figure out how to make long-term promises, 30, 40, 50-year financial commitments, deciding how much we should be charging for that now, collecting the money, making sure it's appropriately invested, and making sure that the companies or the pension plans are setting aside the right amounts of money so that those payments, when they need to be made 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, are made in an appropriate fashion or whatever. So that's sort of the essence of actuarial science, long-term financial security. So there's a chief actuary who works for the government that does the annual projections for the Canada Pension Plan, and all of our contributions that are going there. There's that office also looks after unemployment insurance to make sure that we're contributing the right premiums to pay out all of the benefits that come out of the employment insurance funds or whatever. And then in the private sector, traditionally, we either work for insurance companies or we work for consulting firms advising defined benefit pension plans. From there, the profession's really broadened out to whatever. So there are all sorts of actuaries now working in a variety of investment roles, in a variety of risk management roles, in a variety of very technical, artificial intelligence, those kinds of roles, because the profession tends to attract people who are very, very quantitatively strong, so can do numbers, but want to apply numbers as opposed to theoretical. So often we sit in math faculties or statistics faculties or business faculties or whatever, but the real strength of the profession is sort of a really strong numeric foundation, but then really a practical orientation, real life financial problems, long-term financial security. That's kind of the pitch on the professional side. The profession, historically in Canada has been very, very small, and very small even in the US or whatever. But for the last 10 or 15 years, the big actuarial science schools, Laval in Quebec and Waterloo in Toronto, Waterloo in Ontario, along with a few others, the actuarial science programs have really, really grown because there's been a really big influx of foreign students, particularly from Asia. And the biggest growth opportunity for new actuarial science students is really back in Asia, as sort of the insurance industry and long-term financial security products and retirement savings and those kinds of things start to emerge more in a lot of those markets. So, as the economy gets up to sort of $10,000 US of average income, places like India and Vietnam, certainly Japan and Hong Kong and Taiwan and Australia have had big actuarial science communities for a long time or whatever, but places like Singapore, Vietnam, Malaysia, huge numbers of actuaries going to all sorts of those countries or whatever, and making a real mark or whatever. And sort of Canadian trained actuaries, when I look through sort of the latest publications from the Canadian Institute of Actuaries or others or whatever, there's a big contingent of North American trained actuaries who now work out in Asia. So that's really the big opportunity where the industry is growing. Here, it's a much more mature environment. The industry is really consolidated. Defined benefit pension plans are fewer and fewer. And then people are branching out to whatever, doing a lot more consulting around benefits, a lot more consulting around employee and wellness or whatever. Mornos Soboco, which is now part of TELUS Health or whatever, that does all the employee wellness stuff, all has its roots in traditional actuarial consulting, but people are branching out. So if you're in there and you're advising HR departments on pensions, it's very easy then to build a practice advising on employee benefits, wellness, the broader aspects or whatever of employee engagement or whatever. I think the firm that does our employee engagement survey came out of an actuarial firm or whatever. So all sorts of entrepreneurial work going on. But that's really the core of the programs or whatever. And the big high profile universities, Waterloo, Laval, are the two big ones. But then, Western Ontario, U of T, a couple of schools now in Western Canada, in Manitoba, have reasonable size actuarial programs, and a number of US universities have reasonable size actuarial science programs now as well. So.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I think based on the numbers, I'm guessing that getting jobs is probably, it's one of those professions that because it's specialized, there's not, even with the growth, there's not a ton. So I'm guessing that the jobs are pretty, I don't want to say easy, but there's probably more than say some other professions where there's a lot more available.
Yeah, there's pluses or minuses, right? Like, if you're young and you're flexible, then it's absolutely a terrific profession or whatever, because, the whole world is open to you. You get your Canadian qualifications, you can practice in the UK, you can practice in the US, you can practice in Asia. The insurance industry now is pretty consolidated. The pension industry is pretty consolidated. So, if you're in Winnipeg or if you're in London, Ontario, then there are only a handful of employers who employ actuaries. So in some of those places, it can be a little bit more difficult. And in places like Toronto and Montreal, actuaries are branching out into all sorts of things or whatever. And so, you can go work in a bank and risk management, you can go work in investment management or in an asset manager. And our global chief investment officer, who runs our $260 billion investment portfolio, actually is a Waterloo trained actuary, although never worked as an actuary, went into the investment world down in the US before we hired him back. So lots of very, very good examples. So, we might have something like 300 actuaries at Great-West Lifeco across all of our operations, maybe closer to 400, counting all of the offices in Europe and the US or whatever. So, a good number, but, it's not a big profession. It's not like accountants, it's not like investment professionals, and people cross over or whatever. And, that's really a hallmark or whatever. You get your foot in your door, you get some, really rigorous training, and then you do a little bit of work, and then you take the chances in your career to really build something that can deliver for you, something really, really meaningful or whatever. And how that develops or whatever is really up to the individual. It's just remarkable, the variety of really, really strong careers that people have developed coming out of an actuarial science background or whatever, and the number of places people end up or whatever. So.
Amazing. So I'm going to get to some of the questions in the Q&A because there's some great ones. The first one is, with many people changing jobs all the time, what do you see are the benefits, like pros and cons, of staying at the same company for over 20 years?
So I'll start from the negative or whatever. So, I mentioned my first job was at Confederation Life. And I was there from 1990 to 1994, and it was a long-established mutual insurance company. And for people who weren't in Canada at the time, in 1994, it filed for insolvency, one of the very few insurance companies in North America that went insolvent or whatever. And for me, what was sort of, very, very hard to see was there were a lot of employees at Confederation Life who'd been there for 25 or 30 years, and they've known nothing different than Confederation Life. And so, if you were earlier in your career, like I was, I managed to follow my boss there and found another job sort of within 6 months of Confederation Life filing for insolvency. But if you were there for 25 years and you'd only known one company and you'd only done one thing, then it is that much harder or whatever. And so, I would sit there and say my predisposition, and now I'm talking a little bit against my company's interest or whatever, my predisposition in all of this is, to encourage everyone to develop sort of a broad network, to make sure that those connections out there, because we do live in a capitalistic economy or whatever, and companies do fail from time to time. And even if you go work for governments or whatever, there is no guarantee, or very few guarantees, of sort of lifetime employment or whatever. And so that's my orientation on all of this, is that's not sort of a starting point on all of this. And then the second company that I worked for, North American Life, was acquired by Manulife in very, very short order or whatever, which is what prompted me to go back to get my MBA, because, the insurance industry at the time or whatever in the mid to late 90s was consolidating. We went from large numbers of companies to very few larger companies or whatever. And I really thought my future would be down in the US or maybe down in Asia or whatever. And I really wanted to add something beyond actuarial science, which is why I went off and did my executive MBA or whatever. So I never thought that when I joined Canada Life, that it would be sort of a 25-year run that I've had there or whatever. And when I first joined Canada Life, it was to work on a demutualization project and a US GAAP project. And I thought it was going to be a 2-year commitment or a 3-year commitment to whatever. And it's turned into sort of a 25-year career with the last 15 on the senior management team. So it was not by design. So I always start with I think companies try really hard and they want to build those career paths, but I think we all accept, I think just about every company accepts or whatever, that very few people are going to have full careers with a single organization, that full career path or whatever. And so, my predisposition, my personal advice, and that's not to say you won't luck into what I've lucked into sort of the last 25 years, where I've done 5 or 6 very senior, meaningful roles, all within the same company. And I guess that's the other side of this, that if you do end up staying in one place, given that Confederation Life experience that I had, I would just encourage everyone not to get overly comfortable doing the same thing for a very long time. Like, push yourselves. I think you will be better for it. And then if something doesn't work out the way you think it'll work out, if you do end up in just the wrong place and you have to take that decision to take something else or try something else or whatever, you will have the confidence to do that or whatever, right? So, I think doing that same role for a long period of time, it still might work. Like, I don't want to discourage people from doing it, but do that with your eyes wide open or whatever. And my 25-year tenure now, 24-year tenure with Canada Life or whatever, even that wasn't totally smooth or whatever. Like, I joined Canada Life in 1998, and in 2003, we were acquired by Great-West Life. And in Toronto, we went from 4,000 employees to 500 employees. It was just absolutely brutal during, and now we're back up to 2,500, 3,000 employees in Toronto. So a lot of that has come back because Toronto is the dynamic place. That's where you go to hire the best talent or whatever. But even at Canada Life or whatever, the path has not been straightforward. And there have been some difficult times or whatever. And so I just encourage everyone. Now, staying at the same place has a number of advantages or whatever. You can build the networks within the community, within the company, whatever. You can really understand what the company does. You know the history. You know where some of the decisions were, what was made, why things work, what you're delivering for the customers or whatever. Like, that intimate knowledge of the company's history, can be very, very valuable. And as I mentioned, actuaries are trying to make 30, 40, 50-year projections on things or whatever, and actually knowing what people might have been thinking 20 years ago, 25 years ago, really helps you make better judgments today. Now, I think you can learn that in other organizations. So I'm a big believer in trying to understand sort of the history of the organization, the culture of the organization. Cities are like that, companies are like that. They have their personalities, they have their quirks. CEOs are like that. They have different working styles. Board chairs are kind of like that or whatever. So if you're at a place for a while, you can see some of those comings and goings or whatever. And I've experienced 4 very, very different CEOs at Canada Life in my tenure there, and found ways to work with them. And so it hasn't felt like the same company through that period of time or whatever. There's been remarkable change there or whatever. And so it's a complicated question. I would just encourage everybody to guard against being in that one spot forever, doing the same thing forever. If it works out, terrific. But if it doesn't or whatever, then that change can be very, very hard. And I just encourage people, if you have that chance, take that little bit of risk. Like, I don't know anyone's personal circumstance, so this is a little bit of dangerous advice or whatever, but I would just encourage people, when you have an opportunity, when you can afford to take that little bit of risk or whatever, please take that risk or whatever. Even if it doesn't pay off, you will be better off for trying. You will feel more confident taking the risk that second or third time or whatever, and eventually it will pay off or whatever. And so, I'm a big believer sort of on the investment side. You have to take risk to make money, but most importantly in your career, you have to take that little bit of a risk. You have to know yourself. You have to have that support around you, but being able to take that risk in your career. So for me, sort of as perversely as it sounds, actually having Confederation Life go insolvent was probably a good thing for me in my career. I don't think I would have had the same success if I had stayed there. I think moving somewhere else and then being caught up in another merger, that's what prompted me to go get my MBA. Yeah, and that's one piece of advice that I give my kids now, that it's at least a 2-degree, educational career. So get that degree, then work for a period of time, then do something else or whatever. And I had that opportunity while I was working to be able to do an MBA. And I just encourage everyone, like continuous learning, formal, informal, these kinds of seminars, the podcasts, like there's so much available out there. Read good books or whatever, take inspiration where you can get inspiration or whatever. There is a whole world out there, but really push yourself and do some uncomfortable things, like go to Toastmasters, make a speech or whatever. Like if you're not constantly trying to reinvent yourself, push yourself, trying something that a little bit different or whatever. And that could be in your personal life too, whatever, like, challenge yourself, like learn to downhill ski. Like if you hate winter, dress up warmly and get out there and be active or whatever. That mindset, that orientation or whatever. If there is sort of that common denominator about people who are very successful or whatever, they take risks and they try things. They try different things or whatever. You don't have to be good at everything that you try, but you do have to be out there trying or whatever. And I think that's really, really important. And for me, I got that kick from the failure at Confederation Life or whatever. It forced me to do something that I wouldn't have done, and to really take stock or whatever. And then, choose well, ending up with a good partner or whatever. Like my wife has a sales and marketing background or whatever, and seeing sort of the type of energy that she brings to anything and the passion or whatever. And so I like comfortable things. She likes new things. Like I love going to a restaurant for the 10th time. She loves going to the newest restaurant that's just opened or whatever. And surrounding yourself with people that have kind of different backgrounds, different perspectives, different orientations, moving yourself out of that comfort zone or whatever. As much as it is getting forced to go to a different restaurant and grumbling or whatever, that actually makes me a better person in the office. Because it means that I am not stale, that I can see that different perspective, that when we're trying to make changes, when we're trying to innovate or whatever, I can get behind some of those things or whatever. And I think you can take inspiration from wherever you find it. I just encourage people to do that anywhere, everywhere. So it's all around you.
Okay, that's great. And so a couple of the questions I think we could combine. So one of the questions is, one is like, what are the challenges that you were facing in your career as a visible minority? And another one is there an uncomfortable truth that you faced in your journey that you feel like is important to share? Those might be related, they may not be, but they kind of ask the same question.
Yeah, no, for sure. So I would have said sort of early on, high school, university, the first 10 years of work or whatever, being a visible minority person or whatever, all of your energy, not only are you trying to be competent and do a good job, you're trying to fit in. You're taking your cues from everyone else or whatever, and to sort of use the current language or whatever, you're not your whole self. Like you are not talking about the fact that you went to a Bollywood film down on Gerrard Street on the weekend or whatever. You're talking about the hockey game. So, I would have said, all through university and sort of the first 10 years of my career, it was much more about trying to fit in at the office or whatever, not to stand out so that your work can shine or whatever. And I think, fortunately for all of us, and I think even for the people who used to be in the majority and now, have to accommodate all sorts of different styles or whatever, I think for all of us now, it's just a much better environment or whatever. There's a lot less of trying to fit in and a lot more acceptance that there are people with all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of stories, all sorts of different pressures who come in, and we're still all trying to do the best possible work, but we don't have to fit into a particular mold or whatever. And so I would have said my journey early on was all about fitting in and learning to fit in. And I think there's still aspects of that. Like, if you want to try to make a sale relating to an individual, trying to understand that background or whatever. So while I don't feel that same pressure now to fit in, to sort of hide aspects of myself that I might have earlier in my career, the ability to fit in, the ability to sense where other people are, to understand sort of what motivates them. I think that's still important to whatever, but I think we can do it in a much more authentic way. So, it's funny, we tend to lump in sort of, there are visible minorities and then there are white people or whatever. But, for the years that I was running our European businesses, like you talk to an Irish person versus an English person, and they have 500 years of hostility that they're trying to navigate and overcome or whatever. And to me, they look the same. And to them, they feel very, very different to whatever. And so I would just encourage us, whatever, that those little differences or whatever, they exist everywhere. And we should embrace them everywhere. And so, thankfully, almost all organizations now are really committed to this. So you can bring your whole self into the office or whatever, that everybody understands that we have our backgrounds, we have our personal likes and we dislikes or whatever, and we're not expected to fit in, but that we do have to make space for everyone. So for the last few years or whatever, I've been one of the bigger proponents on our senior management team of making sure that our commitment to sort of diversity, equity, and inclusion is real, like that we're measuring it, that we're rewarding people for it. And it's not just about individuals acting on unconscious bias training. It's things that the company can do. It's changing our recruiting processes. It's changing our interview processes. So there's panels of standard questions as opposed to sort of free form discussions or whatever that go so much more to whether you click with an individual or not. So we're trying to move away from those very personalized things or whatever to make sure that we can accept and embrace people from all sorts of backgrounds or whatever in sort of our hiring and our promotion processes or whatever. So that's sort of the giving back now. So my first 10 years, it was all about fitting in. And now it's really about trying to push really, really hard to make sure that when we make these commitments, which we're all making, that they're real, that it doesn't just come down to individuals having to do the right thing, but that we have the systems and processes. Like, it's not good enough that I do the right thing. I want to make sure that when we hire 1,000 people, that we actually went out and reached into communities. We went out to universities that we wouldn't hire from. We went to programs that we wouldn't hire from or whatever, so that we're getting sort of good, diverse, one of my pet peeves or whatever is we made our commitment to 25% visible minority in all the management groups and in all of our hirings. And that works for Winnipeg, it works for London, Ontario, but 25% is woefully inadequate in Toronto. Like in Toronto, it should be 50%, not 25% to whatever. And so we have to deliver more. And it's those kinds of things or whatever that, I'm trying to advocate for. And I'd encourage everyone, bring your authentic self in. Like you can't get on a subway in Toronto and not see that the city is the whole world. It's here, all sorts of backgrounds, all sorts of dress, all sorts of cuisine or whatever. So embrace that in the office or whatever. I play Bollywood music in my backyard or whatever. And my neighbors, they might not all like it or not like it or whatever, but it forces a conversation with them because I'm playing Bollywood tunes and they'll come and they'll ask me, and that's what I want to listen to in my backyard or whatever. And then I can occasionally play something that they might like too or whatever, and then they'll pop across the fence and make a comment like that as well or whatever. And so I am not shy about doing that now, whereas I would have been 15 or 20 years ago. Like I remember when I was 8 years old and my mom would be on a sari, dressed in a sari on a Friday night, and we'd be on the streetcar on Gerrard Street or whatever, and I'd be totally embarrassed. Now I'd go on and I'd have the biggest smile in the world or whatever. And that's, Toronto has changed so much in that regard. And we can take all of that into our office. We don't have to hide that from our professional life or whatever. It's a meaningful part of who I am and what I bring into the office. So
it's I completely agree. And I went through the same journey of being embarrassed and then now being proud. Arshil, we are at 8 o'clock. I know you said you had a few extra minutes. You're okay if we continue and just answer a few more questions?
Yeah, absolutely. So
okay. Great. So the next two I also think are kind of a combination. So, one of the things about you is you keep getting these progressive promotions, and that's what's happened throughout the 20 years you were at throughout Great West Lifeco, right? So, and when I did my research on you, the reputation for you is, you're brilliant. And then you were the guy that they could count on to get it done. So you would get it done by doing it right, doing it on time, and you doing it within budget. So the next two questions that we're getting in our Q&A are really, how do you prepare yourself for each of these progressive
So sorry, I think you were just breaking up there. So I didn't catch.
progressive roles?
Okay,
And then
so-
when you think about the rising stars, so what are the three commonalities that you see in rising stars?
So you know that it's a very hard question to answer or whatever, because you know they're all sorts of successful people, and I took inspiration from very different kinds of leaders or whatever, sort of that mix of soft skills and hard skills or whatever. So you know my own personal success or whatever, certainly earlier in my career, was all around sort of competence or whatever. I was a good, competent actuary. The technical work got done, it got done on time, it got done effectively, and then it was communicated well, like complicated topics or whatever. And when you communicated the answers or whatever, you know, you were there, you had the facts and figures at your fingertips, and then people asked you questions or whatever, and you could explain it in 2 or 3 different ways or whatever. So that was sort of early on in my career. Later on in my career, like I don't, you know, that would have taken me up to becoming chief actuary 15 years ago, sort of that technical expertise or whatever. When I was running our European businesses for the 9 years or whatever, there is no way across those range of businesses, across 4 different, you know, countries, our reinsurance businesses, multiple offices, that I could be on top of every last detail or whatever. And then it became much more building a good team around you, identifying really, really good talent or whatever, giving them what they needed to be successful, and not being shy about praising them or whatever, and getting the most out of that team or whatever. And then being comfortable talking about the whole breadth of the businesses. So, you know, I sit there and say, early on, my career pivot was really to go get my MBA, build on these communication softer skills to take sort of that technical competence and be able to sort of frame it in the larger context. Later on, it was much more about building sort of that high-performing team around you, identifying the right talent, promoting them, you know, making changes when you needed to make changes, taking risks and promoting people, but making sure you have good teams, because I couldn't have been successful unless I had a team around me, because you could be competent, but if everybody around you wasn't competent, one person was never going to be able to do this alone. So learning to be able to build a team, rely on that team or whatever, was sort of that next phase of success or whatever. And now this last little while is really making myself useful to others. Like the chief executive, like whatever the chief executive needs done that he can't do, that he doesn't have the time for, you know, there's just too many other pressures or whatever. So now I focus on the really, really important things that the organization needs to get done that just fall through the cracks or whatever. So I kind of look at my career as sort of 3 or 4 different phases, that very subject matter, technical expertise, the little bit of broadening, then building the big team and being able to drive a team or whatever. And now it's really sort of that problem solving. It doesn't really matter what it is, whatever that needs to get done. People turn to me. I have the long tenure. I've done lots of different things. People are comfortable with me. So I don't think I could have done this kind of role earlier in my career. Others could. And I just encourage everybody to really think about what they're trying to achieve in each of their roles, where they are in that career journey. And everyone's is going to be different, but you know, be purposeful, be thoughtful, be confident in what you're bringing. Like, be sure you have something to bring, and then bring it and deliver that, and then extend. So, you know, that technical competence, like I can't give anybody advice. Like, you know, if you're an investment professional, if you're an actuary, if you're an accountant, if you're an engineer, whatever it is, you have to be technically proficient. But then we all know examples of very technically proficient people who are spectacularly unsuccessful. And to do that next bit or whatever, you really have to find a way to broaden. And so for me, that combination of actuarial science and then doing my MBA really helped me broaden to think about things end to end, to try to fit in the work that I was doing to what value we were delivering, either to shareholders or to customers or to my colleagues or whatever. That was the next phase. And then the team aspect. So, and other people's careers might be backwards. Like you might inherit, you might not have subject matter matter expertise. Building a big sales team and motivating them might be your starting point. But then, if you then go on to become a senior person responsible for the sales team, then engaging with finance and broadening. So how you broaden and how the pieces work might be a little bit different. But I think those building blocks will be there sort of all the time. The problem solving, the building the teams, the technical expertise, and then sort of being able to communicate sort of end to end, knowing how things fit together and how you're delivering value. Like I think those 4 or 5 building blocks are almost universal. I'm sure we could find 1 or 2 counter examples or whatever, and those are interesting to discuss. But I just encourage people, and certainly in my career, that's been the progression or whatever. Functional expertise, add sort of that communication element, then the team building element, and then really the universal problem solving skills. And it's only in the last couple of years that I'd sit there and say, like, I'm a universal general manager. Like, give me any problem, any industry, I'll roll up my sleeves. We'll figure out what went wrong, what needs to get done, what the right strategy is. We'll bring people along, we'll implement. That's what gets me excited. That's what, when I walk into the office, virtually or in person or whatever, I'm as excited now as that first day walking into Confederation Life. Like, I just walk in with a extra step, a little bit of energy. There's always a problem and challenge to be tackled or whatever. So again, sort of coming back sort of full circle or whatever, that sort of enthusiasm, that sort of passion, there's very little substitute for that or whatever. And if there is something that I would take from, you almost universally from people who are successful, it's kind of that. It's that curiosity. It's that wanting to get things done or whatever, right? Not just wanting to take a pile of paper from one pile, step something and move it to the next pile or whatever. We all have aspects of our job that's exactly that. Like, I have to review somebody's expense report. I have to look at it. I have to sign off on it, and it goes into the next process. Like, we all have that, it doesn't matter what level it is. There's always aspects of your job that are that. Get that done, but then focus on the really, really important things where you're making your mark, where you can put some enthusiasm into it or whatever. And so.
Awesome. So I think I'm going to end on this question that I would like for you to think about with everybody here as we walk away from this webinar. What is it that you want us to know about Arshil that we haven't talked about, that we have, or that's really important that you want to let us know about? Or is there anything that you want to make sure that we walk away from this webinar thinking about?
The one bit that I would add or whatever is maybe just a little bit around decision-making, sort of decision-making under uncertainty or whatever. And maybe this comes back a little bit to risk-taking or whatever. But one of the things that I really, really believe in is, we all have to take decisions. And if we wait and wait and wait, the decision doesn't become easier to take or whatever. So, be purposeful, take the time and energy to understand the decision, the inputs, the best that you can, the outputs, the best you can make a judgment, and then take a decision. And whether it's the right decision or a wrong decision, like the second best decision taken in a timely fashion will probably get you much better outcome than procrastinating and waiting. And I'm not one to take rash decisions, but we should take decisions and make the best decisions, and then don't second guess. So don't wake up the next day and say, did I make the right decision or whatever? Make that decision the right decision, that next day, whatever. And then obviously if things have changed or a circumstance changed, you can revisit that decision, but actually taking a timely decision and having confidence, I think that's something that gets lost or whatever. So, people I think often overcomplicate things. Your whole life, our whole life is going to be filled with decisions that we take where we will not have perfect information. Like, the future is inherently impossible to predict, but we can think about it, we can have a view, and you should have a view. Like, you should be expecting something to happen and then making a decision based on that. But then when it changes, you can change, but make that decision and then act on it or whatever. And, I think that's something even in your personal life or whatever, don't be shy, like take that little bit of risk, make that decision or whatever, and then don't second guess yourself. Like, there are enough people, they're going to doubt you, and it's your job to convince them. So don't doubt yourself. Like, take that best decision that you can, move on that next day. Don't second guess. Be alert to new information, but don't second guess that decision, and then make it work. like that second best decision and go on, like that kind of philosophy, orientation or whatever. It served me well. I always regret it when I don't do that. When I take that extra day and, you know, it takes twice as long when you've procrastinated, you do something, and then I just take myself, I should have just get it done. And sometimes you do it and it goes so much more quickly. And I said, I wasted 2 days worrying about this. I should have just done it. And it's now done and it's behind us and we're on to a different thing or whatever. And, you know, things that just consumed so much time and energy turned out not to be all that important, or you got another kick at the can. So I just encourage people, take that decision, be confident or whatever. And I think one of the questions kind of, you know, talked about South Asian women or whatever, and I don't want to generalize or whatever, but I think that's, don't be apologetic or whatever. You know, like put yourself out there, take that decision or whatever, have that little bit of confidence or whatever. And I'd say that about many South Asians, many women or whatever, that, you know, if you're second guessing yourself, then it's so much easier for your colleagues and for your manager to put you off in that corner or whatever. And so, you know, really put yourself out there, have conviction, and then don't be afraid to say, yes, we made that decision. It turned out to be the wrong decision, but we learned so much along the way, and we're in a better position now to make a new decision that's a better decision. And you learn almost as much from the things that didn't work out as the things that did work out. But the key there was making that decision. So I'm probably sounding, you know, a little bit evangelical here. I don't mean to, whatever, but take that decision or whatever. Like, I think that's really, really important or whatever. And again, that's really served me well as I looked around people who are willing to take decisions usually are the ones that succeed or whatever, that they are not shy. And the people that look around the corner and say, oh, or look around the table and say, okay, what do you think we should do? Those are the ones typically who don't get the promotion. The ones who weigh in to say, this is what I think we should do. What do you think? Those are the ones who tend to get ahead or whatever. And so I'd really encourage that kind of mindset, like take that decision, be brave. So
I love that. And I love that that's the way we're going to end it, because I completely agree with you. Not only is it the decision makers, but it's those that are confident in their decision, even if it's the wrong one, because as soon as you're not confident in it, nobody else is, right? So brilliant. I am so grateful and thankful for you coming here tonight. We are so appreciative. And it's like I said earlier today that, you know, this video will be up on our YouTube, but Arshil, on behalf of Tamils in Finance and all of us here tonight, I want to just thank you again for taking the time and really sharing your wisdom with us.
Oh, I'm delighted to. Thank you very much. So, and thank you for all the good work that you guys are doing. So,
all right. Thank you, everybody, for joining, and thank you for sticking around. I think it was totally worth it to hear the extra tidbits that Arshil had to share. So have a good night, everybody. Take care.
bye.
Bye.